Hi, welcome to this tutorial on using Affinity Photo for image stacking and the production of SHO narrowband images. For this tutorial we'll be using one of the Telescope Live Pro data sets of the Rosette Nebula. It's very high quality data taken with the Chile 4 telescope, and it is available as a Pro data set for download. So to start off with, I'll show you how we can use Affinity to open and stack our FITS images. So we can start off by coming up to where it says File and then just scroll down to New Astrophotography Stack. This will open up what's known as the stacking persona, and on the right hand side here, this is where we'll actually be opening our files. We have different types here, so light is the default one, but we've got bias, dark, flat and flat. These are calibration frames, but for today's purposes we'll be working with data that has already been calibrated by Telescope Live. So all we'll need to do today is just load our calibrated images. So with light selected, click on Add Files and point your menu to where the files are located. In this case we've got 4 images of the Rosette Nebula, 10-minute exposures, and again very high quality data. Click Open and you'll see on the right hand side here's the 4 images. Now you can go through these one at a time just to check them, but I know this data is good, so we'll go ahead and stack all 4. The image looks quite light on the screen at the moment, but we don't need to worry about that. Once we've got the 4 images open, we just come up to where it says Stack and click on that, and it should only just take a few seconds to actually stack these 4 images. They won't look much different at this stage, but that's all gone very well. So the next thing is to come up to where it says Apply, click on that, and this will open our stacked image within Affinity. Now, there's a couple of things to bear in mind here. First and foremost, the procedure that we've just used has created 2 adjustment layers, a levels adjustment and a curves adjustment. You can turn these off and see what effect it has on the image. But to be perfectly honest, I don't think we need to keep these adjustment layers. So the first thing I normally do when I get to this stage is to actually just flatten the image down. So I'm going to use Control F on the keyboard. And you'll see here in the layers menu that our layer structure has now disappeared. Now the second thing to bear in mind is that if you look up here along this kind of menu line, you can see that the image is an RGBA 32-bit HDR image, and it's worth bearing in mind that Affinity is quite happy to work with full 32-bit files throughout the processing stream, and this is a very impressive capability. But what I tend to do is I don't really need to work with the full 32-bit capability, so when I get to this stage after flattening the images, I tend to just convert the file back into a 16-bit grayscale image, and that's done under the document menu, convert format, and just from this list select grey 16 and then convert. Now as we can see on the screen, the image is still fairly light, so we need to do a little bit of work here to correct the background levels and the levels in the nebula itself, and of course the tool to do that is Affinity's levels menu. So I'll normally bring that up on screen just by doing Control L, and here it is, and you'll see it's placed the histogram of the data quite close to the center here. So we've got a big gap on the left and a big gap on the right. Now this latter doesn't really matter that much, but we will make an adjustment. But what's more important is this gap on the left. The way we can correct that is to click on the black level slider and just pull this over to something like about there. You know, as always, I never move this right up to where the histogram starts to rise. We're going to leave a little bit of headroom there, and we'll just do something similar on the other side to the white level slider. So we don't want to go too far with that, and perhaps we'll just bring this a little bit closer now. And once we're happy with this, and it's entirely up to you how much of this you do, I like to have a reasonably dark sky background, but with enough what I call headroom to allow for additional processing a bit later on. And the white level, that's looking okay. In my opinion, that's absolutely fine. So we could leave this as an adjustment layer, but to be perfectly honest, I prefer to just click Merge, and it just gives us our adjusted image. So I think that's looking quite good. If we go back and re-examine the histogram, so Control L once again, You can see that the pixel distribution is moved over to the left as we'd expect. We've still got a headroom here. We don't worry about this gap here, that's perfectly okay. So this is starting to look like quite a good image. So I've just viewed this, we don't need to do anything further, so I'll just click delete. And now we've got our processed hydrogen alpha image. So the next thing to do, of course, would be to do exactly the same procedure for the oxygen 3 and the sulfur 2 data, but it's the same procedure as we've just done, so I won't do it with these additional files, although do bear in mind that the way the images will look, particularly when they're first open, will be quite different, because the hydrogen alpha layer is always going to be the strongest of the three. Usually what you find is the oxygen 3 is a little bit weaker, or quite a bit weaker, and the sulfur 2 is much weaker. But this, this is the normal part of narrowband imaging. So just before we move on to the narrowband processing, I'd like to show you something else that's quite useful to know for future processing with Affinity. Now, at the moment, Affinity isn't able to open FITS files directly. We've opened the individual files to be stacked within Affinity using the stacking persona. But what if we actually want to open an image that's already been stacked? Well, it's pretty much a similar process, but we just approach it in a slightly different way. So if we wish to open maybe an already stacked file within Affinity, we do something similar by coming up to the new Astrophotography stack menu. We'll have light selected, click on add files, and this time we'll open an already stacked image, and it'll open on the screen looking quite similar to the ones before. And what may seem a bit strange, we're going to click on the stack button even though we only have one image open. So by doing that, it goes through the same procedure as before, but with just one single image, and then we click apply, and now we have the image open in Affinity Photo. Now, as before, it's an RGBA 32-bit HDR file. So if you would prefer to work in Affinity using the full 32-bit capability, this is the way to do it. But as before, what I would normally do to prepare these files for further processing, I'll do exactly the same procedure as before, which is to flatten the image using Ctrl F, and to convert the file using convert format, and just revert this back to grey 16-bit, and then convert. And then we do the same sort of levels adjustment as we just did previously. So we can pull this down, pull this over, and we end up with an image that's similar to the one we had before. I'll click on merge, and this is now our stacked image. So this should look a lot smoother. We've got 4 10-minute exposures that have been co-added, but the important thing to bear in mind is this is a technique we can use if we wish to open our already stacked files that are in 32-bit FITS format. And this is quite a powerful capability that Affinity has. So we're done with these two images for now. We can close these down. And what I'd like to do now is show you how we can take images that have been prepared in this way and turn them into a very nice, colourful SHO narrowband image. What I'll do at this point is open 3 files. These have already been prepared. And again, as you can see on the screen, they look very different. This is the sulfur 2 data, this is the oxygen 3 data, and as is usual, the hydrogen alpha data is much stronger and more vibrant than the other two. So these have been pre-scaled using the techniques we just ran through, and now I'll show you how we can actually convert these into a colour image. So the technique I use, and it's quite straightforward, is to always start off with the hydrogen alpha data, and up here on the layers menu I start off by just renaming that HA. And it's important to adhere to this technique. I'll do the same thing to the oxygen 3 and the sulfur 2 data, but it's important that we use the correct names for each of these layers, because this will be important later on when we convert these into a colour image. So we've got our hydrogen alpha layer renamed. We come to the oxygen 3, and I'll use Ctrl C to copy it into the memory area, and then kind of come back to our hydrogen alpha data and use Ctrl V to paste it on top. And here it is, it's sitting above the hydrogen alpha layer. So we'll rename this O3, and that's fine. In fact, we can close the oxygen 3 file down now, we don't need it anymore. And we'll highlight the S2 file. I'll do Control-C to copy it into the clipboard, back to our layered image, and then Control-V, and then straight away rename this S2. And then we can close the S2 data down. Here's our multiple layered image. We can see, if I hide the top layer, we can see through to the oxygen 3. If I hide that, we can see through to the hydrogen alpha data. Now, at this point, it's worth remembering that if you're working with this data, it won't be aligned. The 3 layers will be slightly out of alignment. There's multiple reasons for that, particularly if you've used dithering during the acquisition stage of the data, and that just moves the image round slightly to offset the noise so that when the image is actually stacked, it helps produce a smoother image. Or it may be that just as the image was downloading at the telescope, there'd be a slight pause where the image drifted slightly. It's quite common to have a small drift between frames, but Affinity has a very useful and easy to use tool that will allow you to correct that. Now, initially these 3 files have been aligned, so what I'm going to do is just select the oxygen 3 layer, and I'm just going to move it a small amount to simulate an offset between the 3 files. If we zoom in and I hide the oxygen 3 layer, you can see that when we can see through to the hydrogen alpha layer, there is a slight movement between the 3, and the chances are all 3 of these images will have a slight shift between them, but we can correct this very easily. And the way to do it is to first of all come back to the layers menu, click on the hydrogen alpha layer, and once you've done that, hold down the shift key on the keyboard and come up to the top layer so all 3 are selected. The reason we do it for that way is if we click on the hydrogen alpha layer first, this will then align the other 2 layers to the hydrogen alpha layer, and that's a procedure that I've always used. So with all 3 of these selected, I'll just tick that as well, we then come up to Arrange and then just scroll down to Align Layers by Stars and click on that, and hopefully after a very short period of time we should see that the 3 images have been aligned, and we can check that just by zooming in. We can look at some of these stars. If I hide the sulfur 2 layer, we're now seeing through to the oxygen 3, and that looks fine, looks perfectly aligned. If I hide the O3 layer, we can see through, and that's absolutely fine. So Affinity's done a really good job of aligning our 3 images. So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to call upon a set of macros that have been tailored for use in Affinity Photo. You can create a colour image, an SHO image in this case, using our narrow band data by using the channels menu in Affinity, but it's a very convoluted and sort of round the houses way of doing it. It's not as easy as it is to do in Photoshop or in PixInsight, but we can call upon these additional macros which you can download for a very, very nominal charge to use within Affinity Photo. And if I just pull these over onto the screen, here they all are, and they're the JR Astrophotography 32-bit macros. And there's plenty of them in there, got some very useful features, but the one we're going to call upon is the SHO composition setup. SHO, sulfur, hydrogen and oxygen. So I'll just take this off the screen again so we can see what we're doing. And I've highlighted these here, but we have to do another important step first. At the moment we're just working with a grayscale image. We need to convert this back to the 32-bit format for the macros to work. So as before, document, convert format, and we'll just change it to Rgb 32. You won't see any actual change to the image, but now we can apply the macros. So I'll just go off screen and click on the SHO composition setup, and straight away, instantly, we've got an SHO Hubble palette image. And this is looking fine, and this is what I call the true Hubble palette. We've just used Affinity to preload our oxygen 3 data into the blue channel, hydrogen alpha into the green, sulfur 2 into the red, and this is what's known as the Hubble palette. And as we would expect, we shouldn't be surprised by the fact that it's predominantly bright green because of the strength, once again, of the hydrogen alpha data in the green channel. Well, so far so good. A lot of people might be happy to stop at this point and say, well, you know, it's the Hubble palette, this is what the data should look like, and that's fine. But we can use a very simple technique in Affinity to really give this image some real sparkle. We can help to fix, for example, another typical aspect of the Hubble palette, which is these magenta halos around stars, and as I say, the bright green nebulosity. We've got a channel balance adjustment layer here. If I turn it on and turn it off, it doesn't make any difference, so I'm just going to delete that. We've got our three images here. Now, I recommend that you might find it easier to carry out the next procedure with these 3 layers flattened into one. It's just a little bit more intuitive to work that way. So what I would normally do at this stage is save this file as a 3-layer image, and the way I normally do that is to export the file, and from this list up here click on PSD and then just click export, and that will save the file with the 3 layers for future working on. But we won't do that for now. I'll just flatten the image in the same way as before using Control F, and that'll just sort of free up some resources on the computer. Another important step is to convert this back to a 16-bit RGB file, and again, you can work on this in full 32-bit, but I find it's just quicker and easier to work with it as a 16-bit RGB file. So as before, document, convert format, and we just change it to RGB 16. And now we have our Hubble palette image ready for some further processing, which should really improve the image. And the tool we're going to use for this is Affinity's Selective Colour menu. And the way this works is that we have a drop list of different colours from red, yellow, green, cyan, blue and magenta. I normally don't work with these last 3, so we just do red to magenta. And then with each of these individually selected, we can adjust the sliders to improve the view of the image. So as the image is predominantly sort of yellowy, greeny, blue, I'll bypass the red step for now and go straight into, let's go straight into the greens. And as you'll see, we can start to make some adjustments to the image. This is fairly arbitrary. It's up to you how you approach this, but what we should find that as we go through using this menu, the Selective Colour menu, we should start to see some features really start to pop out of the nebula. We'll go up to the yellows now and we'll do something similar. And if you look along the top here, where we've got some very rich and vibrant structure, this is where we started, and it's got this kind of sort of greenish yellowy hue which isn't that nice, but by moving the cyan slider over to the left, we're starting to bring out additional sort of tonality within these parts, which is working very well. So we can continue along those lines. By moving the magenta slider over, we're really starting to accentuate the details within these outer envelopes of the nebula. It's all very arbitrary, as I've stated, so it's up to you how you process the image. Let's drop down to the greens now. Oh, we've done that already, that's fine. We'll go down to cyan. And the image is actually quite cyan here. As I'm dragging the slider to the left, you can see it's almost decolouring the nebula, which we don't want. If we take it to the right, it's overcolouring it, which we don't. So we'll leave that slider where it was. But by moving the magenta slider over to the right, we can change the tonal value of that cyan part of the nebula, this sort of inner envelope of the nebula, and it gives it a more pleasing, more rounded blue finish, I think, which is great. And if we take the yellow down, that'll even enhance it even further, but that's too far, so we'll just give that a tiny little tweak. And yeah, this is looking good. We'll come down to the blues, but we don't really need to make much of a change here. This is already looking quite good. You may notice perhaps this area here, these weird sort of jets around the central stars. If we take the blue up, it does sort of enhance them quite well, but we won't give that too much. And then do a little bit more with the magenta. By moving the magenta over, it's just kind of it's changing the view of the nebula. We don't need to do too much with that, and I'll leave the yellow where it is. And now we'll go on to the final step of this, which is the magenta. And we move the magenta slider over, it's going to start to reduce the halos around those stars. And that's working quite well. It's not really affecting much of the outer parts of the nebula, I don't think. Perhaps a little bit up here in the sky background, but that's all absolutely fine. So we've finished with the selective colour at this stage. I'll click merge just to blend the adjustment layer in with the main pixel layer. You can leave the adjustment layer open if you wish. I find it easier just to flatten the image down. Now let's have a reality check now. This is where we've reached at this stage so far using the selective colour. If I off screen just take you back to where we came in, this was our original 32-bit Hubble palette image, and it looks quite different by the time we get to this stage. It's looking a lot better, I think. We're starting to see some really fine details up here, and that's exactly the purpose of using this tool. Now at this stage you might be happy to stop with the image. What I normally do is call up the selective colour menu and perhaps go through the sequence again, just giving it some very small tweaks just to enhance the nebula even further. So just moving the cyan slider to the left. If you look up here, it's starting to really accentuate this outer envelope and these sort of ridges along here. So that's, that's working pretty well. Well, you can see the effects there. I'm not going to do too much with that. We don't need to do much there. And again, just sort of change the tonality of the red, but really doesn't need much. This second pass of the selective colour menu should be much smaller. We don't need to do anywhere near as much as we did in the first pass. Yeah, this is all looking really good now. In fact, I just don't really think the greens are going to do much at this point. Yeah, perhaps it's accentuating this area up here. Yeah, I'll just go with that. Yeah, that's all okay. And in fact, to be honest, I'm perfectly happy with that. I won't continue with the selective colour menu. Again, you can make final tweaks if necessary. Yeah, so this is looking good. Once again, we'll do another reality check. This is our original Hubble palette image, and this is where we've got now. And I hope you'll agree that that's a much more pleasing image. We can do a final check on the levels menu, and we're working with quite a big file, so sometimes you might find that when you're running through these procedures in Affinity, it takes a little while just to regenerate the histogram within the levels menu, so we just have to be a little bit patient here while it does that. Okay, so it's generated our histogram. We can just do a final tweak on the black point. Let's bring this down a little bit. Yeah, that's working quite well. That should start to accentuate a lot of these incredible dust features within the nebula. I'm still going to leave a little bit of headroom there, as always, just to allow an additional adjustment in the future if required. But that's looking quite good. So, as always, I'll click on Merge. We can lose that adjustment layer. And this is looking quite good. Now, there is a final little tweak you can make to the image which works really well, and that's to use Affinity's Clarity tool. And what that will do is imparts a small amount of contrast edge adjustment to the image, which really makes these features stand out. It's a very simple tool to use. Once you've finished with your processing, you can come up to Filters and then Sharpen and come across to Clarity. And it just brings up a simple slider down here. So what I recommend you do at this point is just put this on 0. So this is the image before any adjustments have been made, and we can concentrate on these incredible dust features. Just start to bring this over and you'll see the image change in real time. In fact, if I take it too far, you'll see a very dramatic change, and we wouldn't ever want to go that far with the image. But by backing this off to around about, probably just for demonstration purposes, let's take it up to about 30 and then click on Apply. And hopefully you can see that that has imparted a bit of oomph, if you like, to the image. If I just take it back one step, you can see how these features are just sort of popping into view. The contrast is changing ever so slightly. The features in these dust envelopes and these features around here really just popping out of the background. So that's just a final little bonus step on the image, and I think it works quite well. I mean, as always, the important thing to do is never to push the image too far. It's very tempting to really crank that clarity slider up, but I think just a small amount will do a very good job. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to using Affinity Photo for image stacking and SHO colour composition. And again, I'd encourage you to download this remarkable data set of the Rosette Nebula and have a play using these techniques, and I think you'll enjoy seeing the end result. That's it. I'll see you in the next tutorial.